Hello and bonjour. Welcome to the first concert chat podcast of Reno Chamber Orchestra's 25-26 season. I'm your host, Copland Bizet, and I'm joined by music director Kelly Kuo for the podcast, which today we are calling Le Kuo Quotidien. Because who doesn't look forward to a daily dose of Kelly's insights? Nobody, that's who. So, Kelly, what are we going to be sharing with our audience today?
We're going to be giving the audience a little bit of an inside look at my mind and how I created our opening program, the season premiere of our 25-26 season in Reno.
Fantastic. And for those of you who are watching, just off camera, you'll notice that Kelly and I each have a drink on hand. And we are pairing a leaded and unleaded beverage with each of the subscription concerts for the season. And since today we're exploring America's ties to France, we have each made bubbly concoctions. I've got a Saint Germain spritz here. And Kelly, what are you drinking?
I'm drinking exactly the same thing as you because it is 5 o'clock somewhere and I'm ready for a leaded version.
Okay, excellent. So, and we both have our lemon slices, and I stole some mint from my garden. But if you want to pause, if any of you want to pause the show and make your own, we've posted the recipe on the website at renochamberorchestra.org. So let's get started. Cheers.
Cheers.
Salut. So Kelly, broadly speaking, what is the theme or the thread running through this program, and how did you end up deciding on the particular composers and works?
So 2026 is a very important year for the United States. Specifically, it's our 250th anniversary. And I thought, rather than just dedicate one program to this particular subject, why not embrace it and deal with the entire season? So I've tried to shape my season so that there is some kind of an American theme running through it. And this particular opening concert, I thought, there's a very, very important component. We didn't certainly do this by ourselves in terms of separating ourselves from another country. And we would not have had an American Revolution without the crucial help of France. And, they provided financial, military, and diplomatic support. And so I thought, what about a program that focuses in on how some relationships of French composers and French musicologists might have influenced those composers who were here in the United States. And that's how we arrived at the topic of Nadia Boulanger, who was, of course, very, very famous, called Mademoiselle by her students. She essentially was responsible for helping a lot of the American composers find their own voices, championing them. And so I thought, why don't we dedicate an entire half of this program to American students at Boulanger? So that's how I started.
That's so excellent. And I know that she had a lot of influence on many composers throughout the world, but it's always been interesting for me as a musician and as, I don't know, just a curious person, how it became the thing to do for American composers to not just seek out European influence, which makes some sense since this is a sort of a European seeded art form. But why specifically Nadia Boulanger? Like, how did she become such a huge influence?
I think it started with Copland, quite honestly. Aaron Copland, there's this funny story about Copland having gone to the school in Fontainebleau that Nadia Boulanger was teaching at, thanks to Walter Damrosch and Robert Catasecchi, the French pianist and composer. And he was recommended by a friend to attend a class that Boulanger was teaching. And he wrote to this friend or another friend saying that he'd been assigned to this class of some old dodo, referring to Boulanger. Can you believe that?
Wow, joke's on him.
Exactly. And so he was so persuaded by her technique of teaching that he continued his studies with her for 3 years and remained super close to her. And so because Copland, of course, was having great fame himself, other composers got on that boat too. And so the roster of American students who went on to stellar careers, who also studied with Boulanger, it's like reading, a who's who in America's classical music circles. So
So
it's beyond the Americans, of course. There's also a lot of European composers and those from even South America. Astor Piazzolla was famous for having gone to Boulanger and having Boulanger telling him, "You've got to stick to your tangos, buddy, because that is the real deal." And she did the same thing for all of her students. She was not interested in only training her students, but she wanted to develop their own voice and wanted them to reveal their unique selves.
I love that. I knew that there's a famous story of her declining to teach Gershwin because she thought she might un-Gershwin him. I don't know the actual quote, but that's basically it. And so it's interesting about this idea of each student finding their own voice, because I notice of the three composers on this program, Julia Perry, David Diamond, and Aaron Copland, they each have really very different forms of expression, and they all studied with her, and so it just really kind of goes to support your assessment of the fact that she was very individually looking at each of her students. I think that it's interesting. We have the three American composers on the front half, and then George Bizet on the second half. Or I don't know where the intermission is. I'm sorry, I don't remember exactly. But we're starting the program with these three American composers studying with Boulanger, and then we go kind of like back in time, using the time machine, to George Bizet with his Symphony in C. How does that piece of music kind of fit into the overall theme?
Well, there's a funny story behind this, because originally I had wanted to program the Second Symphony of Louise Ferenc, because I had the idea that Nadia Boulanger, very, very a trailblazer, right? She was a woman who had a huge amount of success, colossal success, in a world that was dominated by men. And, Boulanger was, beyond teaching these American artists, was also the first woman to help desegregate Harvard University, because at that time that she was teaching there, the men went to Harvard College and the women went to Radcliffe. And her teaching became so popular that Harvard actually had to authorize men to enroll in her classes at Radcliffe. So I thought, why don't you find a brilliant female composer who was French, who did exactly the same thing? And I thought Louise Ferenc is perfect for that, because she, of course, was the one who was able to argue for and get equal pay with their male colleagues at the Paris Conservatory as a professor, after having won some major awards for composing. But our audiences in Reno had something else in mind, because I had included the Louise Ferenc Second Symphony amongst the possibility of an audience choice at the end of our 50th anniversary season in May of 2025. The choices were the Louise Ferenc Second Symphony, Mozart Symphony No. 39, Haydn Symphony 103. And never in my imagination would I have thought that our audience would have chosen Louise Ferenc. But in fact, by a vote of 60%, they did. And so we performed it beautifully in May of 2025 on our final concert of the season. But that meant I had to rapidly reprogram the second half of this particular concert. And I thought, given the forces that we have, I need another major French symphony that is for chamber orchestra, that is a complete contrast to the music that we have in the first half, which is all 20th century music. And I went to the list of compositions that was given to me on wish lists by some of our own musicians, and found that the Bizet Symphony was one of those. And so I thought, I'm going to put Bizet, because it is a charming symphony in the style of Mozart that is very rarely done by chamber orchestras on a subscription concert. It's often heard in like a pops program and in large symphonies, but to be able to program it as a charming part of a program, it just unto itself, I think is worthwhile. So that's the story behind how the Bizet Symphony got on this program.
I love that we are sitting here recording a podcast for the audience to hear. And we are in a position now, because of this story, to both celebrate the audience and curse them.
Exactly. Thank you, and yikes. Yes. No, it's part of, it's what's funny, Catherine, is that I programmed Louise Ferenc's Third Symphony on my audition concert for the Reno Chamber Orchestra back in 2021, so already 4 years ago. And I don't know if that had anything to do with the audience wanting to hear more of this composer. I know it was well received, her Third Symphony, which is also an astonishing work in originality. And that, seated with the other programming I've done since then, since my music directorship started, which has tended to champion works of composers who are maybe lesser known, or works of composers that are well known, but the works themselves are in fact not performed as frequently. So I've been sort of digging up treasures from my mind, from the classical repertoire, especially for chamber orchestra, and our audience has been able to hear it alongside other very standard works in the classical music repertoire. And I think maybe that has gone into the water a little bit, if so to speak, and people are drinking it and wanting to have more of it.
Oh, well, cheers to that. I will drink this water as well. This water.
Yes, this water.
Delicious. So you're saying you did it to your own self. Okay, I hear that.
Yes.
No, I think it's really great. I've noticed with your programming, it's very thoughtful. Obviously, you spend quite a lot of time with it. You have a long time to think about the programming, and then maybe some quick changes have to be made. For any reason. But the important part, it seems to be that you've created a trust bond with the listeners there in Reno, so that no matter what's on the program, Reno Chamber Orchestra is going to deliver something really exciting or touching or anything in between. And I think this season is, I've prepared for these podcasts. I've looked at the whole season. It made me almost want to move to Reno just to be able to go to all the concerts. It's really fabulous. And this is a great way to kick it off. I think this particular concert and this particular set of music. So you mentioned that you've gotten the audience kind of used to expecting a little bit of either composers that are not well-known, or well-known composers, but their works that might not be as well-known. I think that probably for most folks, Julia Perry and David Diamond are likely the least well-known composers on this particular program. And so I thought maybe you could share some things, some points of interest about Julia Perry and about David Diamond that our curious listeners might want to know, that maybe it would cause them to go and do all of their own rabbit hole researching.
Sure. Julia Perry was a Midwest girl, and I'm currently living in Cincinnati, so the fact that she was born in Lexington, Kentucky, and spent a lot of her life in Ohio, I think has a little bit of relevance here. But what's so interesting is that if you had Julia Perry's resume and you were living today, you would probably be one of the most famous composers in the world. But given that she grew up in the time period that she did, it unfortunately allowed the world to completely ignore her music after she passed away. And I think it's time that we maybe reassess her position in music, especially those of classical music. She studied violin and piano and voice, and was so talented that she went to Westminster Choir College, and after that studied at Juilliard and Curtis, went to Tanglewood. She got a pair of Guggenheim Fellowships, and that's where she studied in Italy, in Florence, where she was mentored by the composer Luigi Dalla Piccola. And after that, she went to study with Boulanger. And this is quite the pedigree. The fact that she was not only someone from very humble beginnings, and the fact that she was Black also contributed to maybe a feeling of not belonging. But at the same time, she became very well known in a very short period of time. One of the first pieces that she wrote in her second year in Italy was a short piece for orchestra, which is the first piece on this season. And it became, I think it was the very, very first piece by a woman of color to be performed by the New York Philharmonic.
Oh, I did not know that.
And the third by a woman at all by the New York Philharmonic. So this is pretty historic in terms of a piece of music by a Black composer and one that was a female. It's quite astounding that more people don't know about her. And if you know a little bit about her life, she actually had a series of strokes, I think when she was in her late 40s, which was been in early 1970s. And that stopped her ability to speak. And it was, I think maybe her right side was completely paralyzed. And so in any case, it was impossible to read her handwriting. So when she tried to have her work published after the stroke, it was really impossible because of her stroke and all of the physical disabilities that she was having to deal with after the fact. And so her work either got lost or they became only available in manuscript.
This is really underscoring for me something that I come back to again and again as I research for the teaching work that I do, or pre-concert talks with the various organizations that I perform with. And people forget that J.S. Bach's works were almost totally lost before Felix Mendelssohn started digging around,
Correct.
to find them. So every composer can have this renaissance if we can even know that they existed. And now, of course, we have recording technology. It's harder to ignore that this or that composer or this or that piece of music once existed. But it's on us as performers and as curators to make sure that we keep these works and these fine composers right in front of the audience, who is ultimately the arbiters of taste and of the way that we form our culture.
Right. There's a great quote that says, "Pieces become part of the repertoire only because we play them, and then let you as the audience decide on whether you'd like to hear them again."
Yeah, I mean, and it seems silly and very obvious, but it's such an easy thing to forget, but that we are consciously really making sure to pair things well, and not just the drinks, that we pair things well, that we provide new context, growing context all the time. I just think it's fantastic that you're starting the program with this piece of music by Julia Perry. What do we know about David Diamond that you'd like to share? Anything juicy or fun or interesting?
Well, let's see. I mean, he was a native New Yorker, a violinist. In fact, he did a lot of supporting his own life by playing in pit orchestras as a violinist. So I love that connection to playing theater music. His parents were immigrants, Yiddish speaking, from an area that's now Ukraine, actually. And he began composing when he was a small child, even though he had not really had any formal instruction whatsoever. Really unique, I have to say. And even though he was very, very immersed in Jewish cantorial music, he really he was influenced by Eric Satie and Ravel. And that's where he really, really tried to dive into his own orchestral study. He was very much known as an orchestrator, and he studied with Roger Sessions, and also Ernest Bloch was a teacher of Sessions, and so he saw this sort of lineage that he tried to honor, but at the same time couldn't ignore Ravel and Satie. And so that's how he started getting famous. It was his first violin concerto that got him to go to Paris to study with Boulanger. And he met all those famous composers at the time who were taking part in Boulanger's various get-togethers, including Stravinsky. And he got, like Copland, he got so entranced with what Boulanger was doing that he went back for a second round with another Guggenheim Fellowship. But his symphonies were premiered by pretty much the who's who of American conductors at the time. Metropolis and Bernstein, Kusevitsky, they all premiered symphonies of David Diamond. And I don't know if there was anyone else who was nearly as prominent as David Diamond during his day. And so his music, unfortunately, has not held up over time. Even though, he was one of those few composers in that period who did not go towards serial music or aleatoric music that was, or even electronic music that was making waves. He really didn't like that at all. In fact, there's this great quote of his that says, "This aleatoric business is simply not music." And so he was somewhere more on the conservative side of the compositional spectrum. And still, that sort of did not necessarily keep his music in the forefront of what we would know as classical music today at the 20th century.
What's interesting to me about this is that serialism, to a certain degree, and certainly aleatoric music, to a large degree, it can seem really foreign to people, and not like music, or what music is sort of normally conceived to be. It's not melody driven. Aleatoric music doesn't tend to be melody driven. Serial music can be melody driven, but the melody is disjointed and kind of difficult to latch onto for a lot of people. And then electronic music could just literally be anything, and that can be quite confusing. And so to say that he lost his footing because his music was listenable, that's really something interesting to think about.
Yeah, he was basically a diatonic composer. Basically a tonal composer. He had strong roots for structure, counterpoint, and yet these things were the things that were making him become more forgotten.
Yeah, less relevant somehow. I think that it's really interesting that we're going to be looking at on this program pieces of music by Julia Perry and David Diamond and Aaron Copland that were all composed, within a couple of decades of each other, yes, more or less. But they all have really, really different expressive styles, as we mentioned earlier, even though they were created around the same time that each of these three composers studied with the same very influential composition instructor, Nadia Boulanger. The Copland, we haven't talked about the clarinet concerto very much. And this is a piece of music that, if it isn't on our listeners' radar already, get ready for it, because it's a fantastic expression and a wonderful, wonderful thing for clarinetists. What can you tell us about the clarinet concerto?
So we have a clarinetist by the name of Benny Goodman, who is completely the person responsible for the genesis of this particular concerto, because he commissioned Copland for this piece. This was at a time when the swing era of big bands was a little bit on the decline, and he was just looking for a way to get back into the public's eye. And he recorded a Mozart concerto, and so he was very much in the classical repertoire as well, even though it might not have been in the public eye. And so when he decided to commission a composer, he chose Copland. And it turned out to be, if there's one piece that you could choose of Copland that expresses everything about him, in a really concise way, I would choose this concerto because it's in two parts and sort of represents both halves for which he was very well known, his style, his landmarks of composition. And when it comes to Copland's Clarinet Concerto, Goodman asked him to write it. And this was after Copland was very famous at that time for having written Appalachian Spring. He had already won the Pulitzer for it. But Copland was going to be off on this Latin American tour for 4 months. And so what came out of that was essentially the second movement of the Clarinet Concerto, which is very, very much more rhythmic and plays very much to the sounds that Copland would have been hearing all around him during this tour. Very, very boisterous, very rhythmic, very fun. Whereas the first half is very much more of the Billy the Kid, Appalachian Spring, the openness of the Wild West, that type of what you might expect of a musical style from Copland is all over that, the musical vocabulary of this first half. And somehow, brilliantly, in the cadenza between those two movements, which is makes this sort of a continuous piece, it basically takes the first style and then morphs it gradually into the second style. It's brilliant. It's a transformation that is, you almost don't even know it's happening until you got there. And this piece is that just was so successful at blending styles, both popular styles and serious styles, if you want, that there's a reason why it's been able to live in this area of the heart that we save for our most beloved pieces.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of sneaks up on you, you know. So I mean, really, anyone can enjoy it. People that are very familiar with sort of Americana sounds, people that are very familiar with jazz sounds, and not very familiar with classical sounds can come to this piece of music and really enjoy it, and vice versa. Okay, well, final thoughts or anything else to add?
Yeah, I actually want to talk a little bit about the Bizet Symphony because you had mentioned, we had talked about Julia Perry and how her music's gotten lost. Well, the symphony in C was lost, or essentially not performed until 80 years after it was composed, because he composed it when he was 17 years old and still a student of Gounod at the Paris Conservatory. And a lot of musicologists point out a lot of similarities in structure between the Gounod Symphony and Bizet's symphony, and there's thoughts and theories as to why it was never something that Bizet even wrote about. Like, no one even knew about it during his lifetime.
Wow.
Until I think it was a musicologist who was going through the conservatory archives and found this symphony by Bizet, and he took it to the conductor Felix Weingartner, who then premiered it in Basel, Switzerland in 1933. 1933 was the first performance, modern day performance, if you will, of Bizet's symphony. And so you can talk about potentially the fact that his instructor had just come out with a piece, and if he had come out with or published his symphony in C, Bizet might have been called a copycat or lost his reputation as a composer in some way, shape, or form. So it just remained unplayed for so many years, and now ever since 1933, it's become very, very popular because it's a traditional four-movement symphony, a lot of things that are parallel in terms of Mozartian style, but it's just full of melodies and orchestration and charm that you would expect from a composer of Carmen. And just makes you think and wonder, what would he have written had he lived past age, 36 is when he passed away?
Yeah.
So young.
Yeah.
And this is the only symphony that we have of his.
It's great to sit and chat with you, Kelly, and be able to learn new things even at my ripe old age. So thank you so much for sharing about this wonderful first program, this October season premiere program. And I guess cheers again.
Cheers. Thanks so much for talking about this with me.